Hello, dear readers, subscribers, and viewers of our social media platforms. Today we have a unique guest, Dr. Greg Simons, a political scientist from New Zealand, an expert in information warfare, hybrid security, and geopolitics. Mr. Simons has taught at universities in Sweden, Latvia, Bangladesh, and the United Kingdom. He is the author of more than 100 academic publications. Most importantly, Mr. Simons is the author of the book Arabian Gulf Security. In 2025, this book was published. By the way, I recently shared it on my social media, where he examines the threats related to the transformation of the security system in the Gulf countries. He specializes in the analysis of propaganda, media, narratives, and the legitimacy of power in the context of global conflicts. Our conversation today will focus on Dr. Simons' book, Arabian Gulf Security. We will cover topics built at the intersection of three deep layers: security as a tool of global governance, the role of media and narrative in legitimizing alliances, and the upcoming transformation of the Gulf region in the context of new alliances such as BRICS, the SEO, and digital currency. Welcome, Mr. Simons, to our broadcasting. Thank you very much for the invitation. Okay, then we begin with the first question. So, is security a reality or a spectacle? Dr. Simons, you write about hybrid security, where not only armies are involved, but also algorithms, economic measures, and cultural narratives. Is security in the Gulf region a defense against real threats, or is it a tool for shaping a managed perception of reality?
No, security, it's not one or the other. So it's not reality or security, spectacle, but it's a combination of both. And we can see this currently with the Israeli war against Iran. You've got reality and you've got spectacle, and these go side by side because, conflict and security require justification and they require legitimacy for a government to act on them. And so this does require an element of reality in order to create the topic or the subject which needs to be securitized. But in order to do that, there has to be some kind of performance, if you like, a theatre. We can definitely see this on Trump's Truth Social if we see the spectacle part of this. And so looking at these, there are different threats. They come from different areas because when looking at the ability to project power and influence, a state or an actor has what is termed as 5 dimensions of strategy in order to project that power and influence. And so if we look at these different strategies, they include physical, but they also include intangible. So tangible, intangible elements. So the tangible ones are projecting power and influence through land. So this is continental power, maritime power, air power, space, and we can see all of these being used in the physical space. But also you've got the 5th dimension of strategy is information and knowledge. And this is intangible, but it affects all the others. And this can come in different ways. It can include, for example, algorithms, which limit or distort what kinds of information we receive. But it also includes communication. So we can get deceptive communication, truthful communication. If we look at these pretexts for war, especially preemptive war, these require some kind of justification and legitimacy. And quite often these are done using the 5th dimension of strategy. That's knowledge and information. But it's quite often done in a dishonest manner. If we look at what happened in Iraq in 2003, and if we look at what the Global South says about Israel's justification for attacking the sneak attack against Iran more recently on June the 13th. They say this is a kind of repetition, a false premises, because this premises which they've been using, someone actually looked back and said this is the exact words they've been using since 1982. So it's a long time. So we can see that there are these different security threats coming from different places. So when we look broadly in terms of information warfare, you have the physical realm. This is where everything is happening. And this is more or less objective because things are happening in a physical space. And when you start to interpret or represent these in the information space or the information realm, that's when the subjectivity becomes more prominent. And finally, the cognitive space, the cognitive realm. And this is where it's a combination of these different aspects are formed in the mind of the audience. And I mean, one can see, for example, with the colour revolutions or Arab Spring, and of course, this is kept in mind, especially in the Gulf states, those potential threats.
Who shapes the strategic agenda of the Gulf? The kingdoms themselves or external directors? To what extent are the Gulf countries truly sovereign in defining their own security architecture? Or is it still a project managed from the outside, for example, by Washington, London, and now also Beijing and Moscow?
If we look historically, this has changed quite a lot. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, one can, of course, see the Ottoman influence even in this area, as well as the influence of the British Empire. As we've further come into these things, and if we look in the current situation, the US is becoming less influential. I mean, of course, it's a big factor because the Gulf states understand that if they do something which is too egregious to US sensibilities, they can all of a sudden get a spontaneous colour revolution, which can occur in their space, which, for example, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, etc., all of a sudden had. So this is kept in mind. But if you look at it, the Gulf states, they do have some certain freedom of operating, but it's one where they're very cautious. So what they're trying to do is the strategic ambiguity and hedging. So on the one hand, that they still keep contact with the global north and the United States. But on the other hand, they also are becoming increasingly tied to the global south through BRICS, for example. And this is this balancing which they're trying to do. I think they understand that the time of US and in general Western hegemony is coming to an end. And it's mostly coming to an end because of its own stupidity and own arrogance, which is causing this. And events like what we see between Israel and Iran are only going to accelerate that. So, but this is still a massive security threat for them. So one can see definitely Moscow does have an influence in the region because it's trying to be a kind of honest broker as opposed to the US role of a powerful broker. You do things our way or else. And do what we say, not what we do, these kinds of things. But Moscow tries to play a more balancing role. And you can see, for example, when you have the king of Saudi Arabia visiting Moscow and so forth, this public diplomacy approach seems to be paying some kind of dividends. And if we look personally between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, bin Salman, and Vladimir Putin, who are doing informal handshakes and these kinds of things, there is a personal connection and there is also an institutional connection. And one should never forget the influence of China, because China were able to resolve a very long, intense conflict and standoff between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was brokered not by the United States, not by Russia, but by China. So their diplomacy is definitely having an effect. And so you can see that these Gulf states, I mean, they're not strong militarily, they are strong economically. And I think one of the things which they're using to mitigate against potential future scenarios is, for example, this economic investment and human investment. And so economic investment, I'm talking about investing finance in foreign companies and so forth, and bringing foreign companies into there to diversify their economy. But they're also doing like China was doing intensively 10, 20 years ago. That is bringing foreign experts from the global north to the Gulf states in order to increase the knowledge capital in these countries. So they're taking a very broad-based approach to increase their resilience and their ability to mitigate. I think what they're mitigating against is this understanding eventually there will be a collapse of the global north, and especially the US. And one can see, I mean, the end of the petrodollar is almost in sight. So they're trying to prepare for these things in advance.
Thank you, dear friend. Next question. What will happen to security if oil ceases to be a currency of influence? Your work comes out at a time when oil is losing its status as an absolute resource of power. If dollar-based oil trade is rolled back, how will the hierarchy of power in the Persian Gulf change?
So, I mean, this is coming into some of the things which I've been talking about just now. I mean, these different currencies on the coming end of the petrodollar. And I mean, one can see, for example, the Gulf states are trading with China and yuan, and you see the end of this deal, this petrodollar deal with Saudi Arabia. You have all of these different economic things. This is the geoeconomics which is supporting the geopolitical goals of the Gulf states. And the ultimate goal of the Gulf states is to be what would we say? To be a subject of international relations and not to be an object, because they understand the cost of being an object. I mean, one just needs to look at what has happened, was happening, I should say, to Jordan and so forth, who have foreign powers, especially the British, with a very strong hold over them. And yet at the same time, in Jordan, you have a very large Palestinian population. So you have a multitude of different risks there. So their goal is to somehow avoid these pitfalls. Of course, this is problematic, and one can say that the American attempts to bring in this NATO, because Trump in Trump 1.0 talked about a Middle Eastern NATO, and I think they understand this would be a very bad deal for West Asia. Because they've seen what's happened or happening to NATO in the Ukraine conflict. NATO is not doing well in this respect. And if we look at the geopolitics, they see China is rising. They see Russia is rising. So India, these other countries, and they see the West is falling. And they see these, if we go back to this idea of performances of the American political establishment and the European political establishment, you can see they just want to sort of like a little bit of distance from that but not to disengage so that completely, so it would incur some kind of sanction. So at the moment, I mean, for example, we can see that West Asia and the Gulf states are actually being these points of mediation between the global north and the global south. So Saudi Arabia hosting negotiations between US, Ukraine with Russia, and Oman between the US and Iran. So they're setting this middle ground as bridges between the global north and the global south. And I think they're doing quite an effective job at doing so. And this is quite a good survival strategy, and to ensure that they remain subjects and not to become objects of international relations.
Religion, secularism, and security, are they allies or enemies? Can Islamic identity, for example, Shia or Sunni, become a platform for a new model of regional security? Or will any form of religious subjectivity be marginalized as a threat to stability?
Oh, I mean, identity and culture is a big thing. And if we look historically, I mean, external powers have used culture and identity to keep these divisions in the West Asia so that they can continue to exercise hegemony over West Asia. I mean, if we look, the Shia-Sunni split, but also tribal splits, ethnic splits, these kinds of things have been used by the British Empire and others as a means for divide and conquer and to continue the rule. This is something which seems to be getting learned, and I mean, if we look, one of the big steps to bridging the Sunni Shia schism was the fact that China managed to mediate that. Because if we look at what the US has been doing historically, one of the geostrategic imperatives has been to create client states in the West Asia. And so what is a client state? It is a state that is protected militarily, economically, politically by the United States, and one which is obedient to the directives of the United States. Because the United States, it's a maritime and aerial power. It's not a continental power beyond its own continent. So it needs other actors to carry out its dirty work in other continents which are far-flung. And one can see, certainly from 1980 to 1989, they used Iraq against the newly established Islamic Republic of Iran in a bloody, costly war, which the United States, even at that time with its much greater military capability and capacity that it has today, it would not have been able to manage such a large-scale conventional war. And so this is something that they've been doing in the area. And you can see these small US military bases everywhere dotted through the region, including those which are not legally meant to be there. I mean, Iraq has told them to leave. Syria, they were never invited. So you can see that these, I mean, it's a variant, a form of this gunboat diplomacy by colonial powers of the past, to have these outposts there to keep an eye and keep the obedience of these countries. But now, if we look at it now, I mean, it's a much bigger problem for these countries, because they know now that Iran, for example, which was written off by the US and the West as a hollow power, has proven itself that it's not a hollow power, that it's very capable of modern warfare and at long distance, if we look at the current war which is ongoing. And so this is something because we see the shift. These Sunni Gulf states are saying to the US, we do not give you permission to launch strikes by your military bases on Iran. I mean, this is something they've been verbally saying directly to them. So this shows that this schism between Shia and Sunni is less, because they understand that collective security means getting on with your neighbours in a decent fashion and not being manipulated by external powers like the United States to go to war with your neighbours. For example, if we look, Saudi Arabia was used as a tool against Yemen. I mean, it failed to achieve this, but it made it dependent on psychologically, cognitively on the United States, and was more willing to do what the United States asked because it had this dependency.
Information wars as the matrix of future conflicts. Your experience in analyzing propaganda and media technologies is exceptional. The Persian Gulf is a testing ground. Who wins in this war? The one who controls territory or the one who controls the perception of it?
So, I mean, this is one of the points. Perception can be, and often is, more important than actual reality. People respond to what they think is happening, what they understand is happening, which is not necessarily so. And we can see, I mean, the war, I mean, we talk about the fog of war and issues like this. And I mean, just looking now, I mean, the so-called fog of war is quite often enforced. As a contemporary example, I mean, Israeli government is banning any footage by Israeli media or even foreign media of the effects of the Iranian rocket attacks on Israel. This is completely prohibited, and they've been raiding even foreign journalists and confiscating materials. So this shows this issue of perception and particularly conflict. Of course, they understand that there are different vulnerabilities in the Gulf states, and they attempt to use these. I mean, the so-called Arab Spring was one of those ones which demonstrated to the Arab and Muslim world this issue, which, of course, Russia and the region experienced almost a decade earlier, that perception can be used to drive audiences to do things which would not ordinarily be done because they have a certain belief that there's certain what do you call it? This motivation to go forward. But you can also see that these colour revolutions are not as effective as they were in the past, because if we look at the example of Georgia, there's been this is out of the Gulf region, but gives a good example. If we look at Georgia, there's been a remarkable concerted attempt to do a regime change on the Georgia Dream government. And this has failed against all odds and expectations, and with the usual NGOs and different diplomatic coercion and so forth. And the rest of the world looks at that, including the West Asian states. So this idea that this information warfare has this almighty power which cannot be resisted, well, it's been proven, well, it can be resisted if you prepare your population and so forth, and looking at the basic issues of what makes a country vulnerable to information warfare. Because if we look at information warfare and the associated political warfare, there are a number of things which make information warfare more effective. So if a country has an economic downturn, this is one of the first conditions that must be. I mean, most of the Gulf states do not have a downturn in the economy. I mean, if we look at the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, they're very rich. So you don't have this mass discontent. You can have mass discontent by other means. For example, if you look at the gap between what the governments say and do about what's happening in Gaza to the Palestinians with what the public sentiment is, you can see that there is a gap.
Yes, yes.
But in terms of economic poverty, they do not suffer that. So you do not have this overwhelming hardship across society that, for example, Ukraine, Georgia, Egypt, and Tunisia, these countries had. And so the next point is that the open communication between the government and the public needs to be severed in order to increase the chances of regime change. So if there is a severed direct communication, that means others can communicate and the government becomes more isolated. So, for example, this is one of the reasons Georgian Dream government is still there. They did not allow this cutting of direct communication with the public. The third point, there needs to be some kind of event to draw the public from being primed to being mobilized. And this can be, for example, an election or some politically sensitive moment. And one can see that in many of these color revolutions, Arab Springs, there was this came at a politically sensitive moment. And the fourth point, that all of the before can be greatly helped in success by the intervention of a foreign power to support, coordinate, and do a lot of the support work for those. So this information warfare, I mean, more people understand it. I think this understanding has come from, I would say, an overuse of information warfare in the region, and the fact that it hasn't really evolved, that you hear this term cookie cutter approach. So this standardized, just apply the one blueprint. I mean, everyone's heard the Libya blueprint, for example. So you apply the one scenario to all kinds of different cases. So if we look at that, one can see there is that issue, but I think one of the other points, the West or the global North is losing its image internationally, and this has most definitely occurred in a concentrated form by the support for the Netanyahu government over what's happening in Gaza. This has absolutely alienated not only most of the global South, but increasingly even the publics in the global North. So you're getting these kind of reactions by people, ordinary citizens in Germany, across different European countries. So this glowing image, and I mean, just looking at the so-called leaders of the free world, I mean, Trump, I mean, Cullis, von der Leyen, these people, if we're to put it diplomatically, are, shall we say, a little bit intellectually challenged, if we're putting it in nice terms.
Of course.
And they can see the damage that these people are doing to their own countries. I mean, for example, I mean, we just look at this horrible Baerbock, the so-called ex-foreign minister of Germany. She would travel to Syria to shake hands with the head of Al-Qaeda, you know, the new government of, what was it, woke jihadists in Syria. And for her troubles, her face was pixelated by the Syrian media because she wasn't in a hijab. She wasn't properly dressed, but she still went there to humiliate herself.
Mr. Simons, do you have your book on hand? First question: deep alliances and geopolitics. How do you characterize the growing role of seemingly unrealistic alliances between Gulf countries and Asian powers? There is a notion of a civilizational dialogue at the forefront. You yourself have written about this. How stable are these alliances?
Alliances are stable so long as the interests remain in alignment, because, I mean, if we look, so long as the interests align, the alliances will remain. I do not see, for example, a Middle Eastern NATO that Trump was talking about, because this is just, especially now, absolutely and utterly unrealistic. If we look, I mean, they're moving away from these military alliances. So we can see, for example, that Saudi Arabia and China have a functional relationship now, which they didn't have one at all before. So you had military kind of tension between the two. But I can see the main focus is not going to be on military alliances, but economic alliances. Because many of these countries in the Gulf lack the resources, the political will, and the populations to have a standing army, for example, the size of Iran or China, United States, Russia, these large powers. So, I mean, their focus is going to be on the ability not to have the hard power of military force, but the soft power of economic attraction. And this is what you can see. So, for example, if we look at the United Arab Emirates, it's making it very easy for foreign companies to move and settle there. I mean, we look at Telegram and Pavel Durov before he got kidnapped by France. And I mean, this is where you're having this collection of different economic interests. I mean, this is far more profitable than sinking money into military, for which there can be no good outcome. I mean, they're probably looking and scratching their heads at the moment how Trump is trying to tell the European vassals, you must spend 5% of your GDP on American weapons and make American military industrial complex rich. I mean, what's the payback? So you got pragmatism versus ideology. So, yes. I mean, the global south is pragmatic. The global north is not pragmatic and deeply ideological.
Next question: technology and security. In your book, you discuss the impact of technology on regional alliances. Which specific technologies do you consider critical for security, from artificial intelligence to cyber systems, and who holds the technological advantage in the Arab world?
I mean, if we look at this, I mean, artificial intelligence, machine learning, this is the new frontier. I mean, I think Glenn Deason, in one of his recent books, has been talking about this as the next industrial revolution, where you have this competition in the sphere of this high technology. I mean, this is why we're having these, if we go outside of the immediate West Asia, this is why you're having these conflicts and trade wars with the United States is having with China, because China is starting to get into an advantageous position technology-wise in relation to the United States. And of course, when you have countries like the Gulf states, I mean, they're watching this, they're taking this in, and they're learning. So, I mean, they understand that it's in their collective interest if they develop these things together, because these are very expensive and resource intensive, especially capital in terms of financial capital enterprises, but it also has potentially a lot of payback for it. So, I mean, these supercomputers, chips, the AI, machine learning, these kinds of things, they're not, don't want to be left behind, because if you get left behind, historically, you get taken over by foreign powers that are not behind. And I mean, 500 years of European and US dominance has left this mark on the minds of what we now call the global South. That if you get far enough behind technologically, it makes you an easier target for hostile takeover. And so, I mean, this is their common interest at the moment. And I think, I mean, there is also this life after oil. So, I mean, this is something that they need to start working on now, because, I mean, how long this dominance of the oil industry will remain. It's an open question, and it would be stupid to just not plan for a time when this oil dominance finishes. If you're not preparing now, you're creating lots of security that is, especially economic and political security and stability. You're creating hazards and risks in the future, whenever that may be. So definitely, it is in their interest to work collaboratively on these new technologies, and one can see that. I mean, you just look at the cities of the Gulf states. They're extremely modern. They are, I mean, far ahead of most cities if we look in Europe, and definitely the US in terms of their infrastructure and, I mean, even if and functionality, because, I mean, this is something the US, I mean, it's neglected its infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and Europe is doing so too. And this is only going to increase, because, I mean, the Gulf states can see that the deindustrialization of Europe and this self-destruction of the United States is not going to decrease. It is, if anything, going to accelerate, because of the utterly stupid and self-destructive policies of the so-called leadership. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs, I mean, has already on numerous occasions warned of this as well.
Yes.
Extremism and regional threats. In your writings, including your co-authored work with your Arab colleague, you provided recommendations and tools for countering extremism in the Persian Gulf. Which of your recommendations have proven effective? And are there any ongoing discussions about possible unintended consequences or risks associated with these measures? That is, the recommendations you outline in your works.
I mean, extremism is something which they take seriously. I mean, it is a threat there, where you have these different groups, such as Wahhabism and other such groups, not to mention those more inclined towards exactly terrorism, as, I mean, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth. There is, they are keeping an eye on this, and one can say that this is a sensitive thing. But I would say that if you have a population which is relatively content economically with their life, you have less chance of extremism. And for example, I mean, it's out of the Gulf region, but a colleague of mine in Egypt, I mean, she did a study at a time when you had this myth that ISIS, Islamic State, the only ones going to Islamic State were these illiterate and poor people. And she did a study and said absolutely not. Rather, it was quite a surprising finding for her because the illiterate people tended to be more religiously educated. So they knew what was in the Quran and were less vulnerable to misinterpretation and misrepresentation of the Quran and its teachings. But also, the unemployed people, they're trying to exist somehow in quite a harsh environment. Instead, she found that these people are thinking about the physiological needs of themselves rather than the psychological needs. So the ones that were the most susceptible to being recruited by ISIS were children of rich parents who were highly educated. So they filled with these different ideas about justice, equality, these kinds of things. And they had time on their hands because they didn't have to work long days so they can survive financially. And so they were seduced because they were not religious, but they had these deceptive and manipulative messages which sounded seductive from ISIS and the likes, because it talked about liberation, about fulfilling these kinds of higher order psychological needs, being part of something, building something, these kinds of things. And so it kind of spoilt that myth. If we look now, I mean, one of the things which they might be a bit cautious about is, I mean, what are going to be the longer term effects of the fall of the Assad government in Syria? I mean, will there be any spillover of that? But I think now the issue might be any kind of unrest which is being triggered or potentially can be triggered by the Israel-Iran war. I mean, how will that disrupt the social, economic, ethnic structure of the region? And will it drag other players in? I mean, you got Trump pontificating and bloviating about what he is and isn't going to do to Iran, and then changes his mind pretty quickly when he realizes that maybe Iran can actually hit back. So, I mean, you've got a lot of uncertainty. And from that uncertainty, you've got potentially instability. So, I mean, hence, I mean, this is one of the reasons, I think one of the firm reasons why these Gulf states with US military bases on have been firm. You cannot use your military force against Iran from here because there will be retaliation, and that can have uncertain political consequences and create kinds of instability that might not be easily calculated for.
Our next question concerns COVID-19 and public social security. How did the pandemic change approaches to governance and security in the region? Which socio-economic challenges were overcome and which ones have persisted?
From COVID-19 and the means with which it was managed or mismanaged, depending on how you view these things, I mean, one of the biggest shocks, and I mean, this is not only for this region, but globally, is it disrupted the whole established global supply chain. And it threw a lot of things into deep uncertainty as well as creating financial hardships. I mean, looking what has happened, I mean, if there is another repeat of this, then I would suspect they're going to be more cautious than just going with the group consensus. Because if we look at the so-called group consensus in Europe, in the United States, I mean, it was an utter disaster. I mean, the mismanagement of COVID, it created social hardship, it created economic hardship, and it's creating all of these different tensions. Not to mention the massive exchange of wealth, which went from the poorer part of the population to the richer part of the population. So whether people would go for that again, this is another question. But I mean, if we're looking at the economic lessons, I mean, it was very costly, these different measures. I mean, they decimated economies. I mean, even, for example, Sweden, which did not have lockdowns, I mean, you had a lot of small, medium businesses close because of the economic shock and the lack of economic activity by customers. So, and of course, I mean, these Gulf economies are not so diverse as, for example, Sweden was then, or cases like this. I mean, so I mean, if we look at this way, yeah, I mean, there were big lessons learned from COVID and how the responses were made, not only at the level of controlling the population, which in the most part failed because Sweden, which had no lockdown, the infection fatality rate was not markedly different from those who had severe lockdowns and long periods of basically imprisoning their population. And looking at this, I think that the Gulf states understand that they don't have the depth of economic diversity to endure another situation like this. So from this perspective, yeah, I would hope that lessons have been learned and probably taken in. So, but the problem is that, once more, it's coming back to that one of those first questions. You have reality and you have theatre.
Yes.
And you have some kind of perception. People don't necessarily react to what is the actual problem, but what they perceive to be the problem. So instead of addressing the actual problem, they can have a go at addressing some of the symptoms. And this is ineffective and quite often very costly.
Mm-hmm.
Law and Humanitarian Intervention. In your book, you examine the lethal doctrine in relation to Syria and chemical weapons. How can one balance adherence to international law with securing the strategic interests of the Gulf countries?
I mean, yeah, I mean, this chemical weapons issue is especially in Syria when we're talking about these alleged chemical weapons attacks. I mean, there are many problems with that. For example, I mean, it is known that the Office for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons deliberately falsified one of their reports to implicate the Assad government in chemical weapons, which, I mean, if you're talking about responsibility to protect and these kinds of humanitarian intervention, it doesn't sit well because this is an obvious manipulation. this is coming back to the same manipulative and deceptive tactics used to try and legitimize and justify the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, which has been creating untold political and geopolitical instability in the region. So if we look at this, I mean, one can look, I mean, if we move even outside the chemical weapons now, I mean, more recently, the International Atomic Energy Agency said all of a sudden that Iran was building nuclear weapons. At a time when Tulsi Gabbard was declaring in front of a Senate hearing in March that US intelligence said that Iran did not have nuclear weapons and was not even building them. So unfortunately, you're getting these international institutions compromised because of the geopolitical ambitions of countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany. The usual suspects are involved in this. And I mean, I think this is providing quite a lesson for the Gulf states, because this is about engineering consent, what you see, this responsibility to protect. I remember when they invoked this responsibility to protect in Libya, and the UN Secretary General said, well, we cannot allow another Rwanda to happen. We cannot allow another Cambodia to happen. We cannot allow another Srebrenica to happen. And if you just look at these false logics, because their whole thing was we need to have foreign troops there. Well, I mean, the Cambodian genocide by Pol Pot, that wasn't stopped by a Western country. That was stopped by communist Vietnam. They're the ones who entered there and toppled the Khmer Rouge. If we look at Rwanda, foreign troops were there. They stood by and watched the civilians get massacred by getting hacked to pieces in the most brutal way. Srebrenica, you had foreign troops there, Western foreign troops like in Rwanda, and they just stood by. So the problem with this humanitarian intervention, they understand that the problem with this is that it's quite often built around, to use this term, this facade, this showmanship.
The role of Russia in the region. In your books and writings, you analyze the myths surrounding Russia's foreign policy. What are the real changes in Russia's strategy compared to how it is perceived in the region?
Has been playing quite I would say quite an intelligent and well-executed diplomacy in the region. And you can see that they've been preparing this for some time. I mean, beginning with when Russia Today was broadcast in Arabic, for instance, back in 2007 or 2008, something like this. So you could already see Russia moving into and trying to influence the region. And this was done on the basis of the doctrine of information security, so that Russia, to get its own perspective of Russia in the world, as opposed to Russia being represented by powers that are not necessarily friendly to Russia or Russian interests.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, definitely, I mean, I had an edited book which was published at the same time as the book I showed you, which was about Russia's use of Islam and Muslims in its internal and external politics. Mm-hmm. And here, I mean, you can see this introduction, because if you look at Russia, I mean, earlier that you have this image, this Orthodox nation. You didn't hear the other traditional religions, which are also there and part of the constitution.
Yes.
But if we look now, I mean, Islam is quite widely used, and this Islamic factor is much more prominent in Russian foreign policy, which is getting it in as an observer in OPEC. I mean, you had these Chechen military police in Syria doing the what you broadly call military diplomacy, because they're not only Russian, but they are Muslims. So this has been played more, and one can definitely see with the strategic partnership with the Iran, but also, I mean, there's Russia's attempts to be, to use an expression, a friend to all and an enemy to none. And this move away, which is in part anticipated and definitely since 2022 enforced, this move away from the global north to the global south. And so, I mean, these different factors are playing much greater roles. So Russia is getting involved, I mean, culturally, economically, militarily, politically. So you can see a much more active participation. And as I say, I mean, Russia is attempting to play this role as an honest broker. That is, to not favour overly one side at the expense of another, which is what the US is so obviously doing, and it's been doing for decades. Looking at this, I mean, we can see it has borne results, because, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, you had these mediations which are taking place in Saudi Arabia. I mean, you're having the visits by the heads of state. And if you look how Vladimir Putin is received in West Asia, it's quite often much more ostentatious greeting than European leaders when they arrive. So you can see there seems to be some kind of appreciation there. And I mean, these things can always change, and there are attempts to try and create problems. But I think the general basis for this, and of course it's been solidified more, I mean, through this expansion of BRICS, for example, which creates a non-Western institution, and an institution that is not controlled by the West for the global South. So you're having the Russian interaction at different levels in the region. You're having it at the personal level, leader to leader. You're having it at the institutional level between the different countries and the ministries, but also at this international level in terms of new institutions which are being created or being joined, OPEC, BRICS, and so forth.
Yes.
Next question. Water scarcity and natural disasters. Various works mention the risks related to water security and natural catastrophes. To what extent is this issue underestimated in regional political roundtables, and how is it connected to climate change? This is a very important question.
Well, yeah, I mean, the issue of climate change is something which has not died away. I mean, it is something which has definitely become less prominent, especially with Trump 2.0 coming in and kind of taking out this as he did during Trump 1.0. But for the region, I mean, it's not an area that you think has too many risks. I mean, you think sandstorms or things like this. But if we look recently in some of the Gulf states, I think it was the UAE, United Arab Emirates, where you had flash floods. And I mean, it's not something you associate with these regions in the desert. being subjected to flash floods. I mean, one of the things which they have been exploring or monitoring is this idea of this cloud seeding and this weather altering mechanisms, which, I mean, these services are available so that they can make the land area more, what do you say, more amenable to agriculture and other different forms of land use. This is something that they're definitely working on. But of course, if you're going to change the climate in your own country, there are consequences for changing the climate, and those are not always predictable. So, I mean, this goes anywhere over the planet. But if you lack, I mean, if you have this desertification, I mean, there is little to mitigate some of these extreme weather conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, dear friend. Next questions. Cybersecurity in healthcare. The head of the United Arab Emirates Health Card Organization and cybersecurity has introduced a new perspective on emerging threats. What real incidents have already occurred, and what should other countries in the region do to avoid similar threats?
In terms of cybersecurity and its the costs if cybersecurity is not insured. Yeah, I mean, this is clear. I mean, cybersecurity is a big issue, especially if we look at society and especially in the Gulf states, where you have this automation of many different functions and systems of the national critical infrastructure system. And of course, if this gets compromised either by some kind of technical fault or by some kind of sabotage, this can have a massive effect, not only in terms of economic cost, but political cost and cost potentially of life. We look at what happened in, as I say, coming back to what happened in Tehran, in Iran on the 13th of June. One of the methods of disabling the air defense systems of Iran was a massive cyber attack, which was also coordinated with the drones and other military sources of attack. So, I mean, this brings home, I mean, if your system gets compromised, you can be opened up to all kinds of things. I mean, you mentioned if you look at the health system, if a hospital gets hijacked or held to ransom, or even a technical fault that puts it out, I mean, this is going to cost a lot of political capital for those who are responsible for the management of the healthcare system and also the government. So this is something very clear. I mean, and there are those different groups out there, both state and non-state actors, that are looking for these easy points of entry in terms of cyber to inflict damage or to hold hostage for financial gain these things. And I mean, the Gulf states, being what they are, rich countries, will potentially make a more tempting target, especially not having these military capability and capacity to, for example, to retaliate. Like, I mean, NATO say if they suffer a cyber attack, they will retaliate with conventional military means against the originator of the attack. I mean, Gulf states, this is a much more problematic thing for them to do. So you have these vulnerabilities and risks, and so this is very much a matter which requires careful technical management and development, which makes this issue, which we're talking about before, the development of artificial intelligence, machine learning, excuse me, and these different technologies important as a means to try and mitigate and prevent such occurrences.
Okay.
Dear friend, we have the last two questions. In the media discourse, I would like to remind you of the example of the Rohingya. The head of that media discourse platform mentions the destructive narrative surrounding the Rohingya. Is there a similarity with the rhetoric in the Gulf media toward their own minorities?
I mean, this minorities issue is a potential source of risk for state security, especially. And I mean, also what I mentioned before, I mean, this issue where you have this careful balance between the state and the people, because if we got issues like this Palestinian genocide and how the state reacts and how the people react. So you've got these different issues which require careful narrative management. Of course, from the perspective of Israel and the United States, if we look just before October the 7th, there was an attempt to normalize relations between the Gulf states and Israel. And these almost were achieved. And now we can see post October 7 that this is not possible, even if the Gulf state governments actually wanted to. The cost of doing so would be their legitimacy, and you would get quite a strong reaction from people. So, and you can see that there's a stronger reaction. For example, if we look at Saudi Arabia, who actually said there can be no negotiation until the Palestinians have their own homeland. So you can see this reaction, and you have this narrative which is very carefully being cultivated. And I mean, it's understandable why. And you have the interests and the objectives of the state, but you have the sentiment and the emotions of the mass public to understand and to not irritate too much. And I think they understand that because, unlike the West, I mean, they are much more pragmatic in terms of their approach, and are not blinded by this ideology which the West has got fixated on, turning everyone into a democracy by the barrel of a gun,
Of course.
etc.
Of course, yes.
Thank you. And the final question, your opinion, Rethinking Security. Your joint article with Oleg Ivanov offers a new perspective. How do you think the very concept of security will change in 10 to 15 years in oil-producing countries?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a complex question given the current state of global affairs at the moment.
Thank you.
You've got Ukraine, you've got Israel, you've got the tensions in the South China Sea. So, yeah, I will look in my crystal ball, and I would say
Yes.
if we look at things, the global north is it's in relative decline. This relative decline means that it is the US is no longer the absolute hegemon. It is still kind of this unipolar power, but it's at the point where it's about to lose this moment, and especially to leading elements of the global south, in particular China. So, I mean, this is why geoeconomics is such a big thing in supporting the geopolitical program. And I mean, one can look at the desperation on Trump at the moment and his attempts to use geoeconomics, especially economic warfare, to try and save what is left of the United States.
Mhm.
So, I mean, if you look at the logic of it, all these trade wars and these different tariffs, I mean, what are they intended to do? The United States is bankrupt. So,
Yes,
uh,
definitely.
this is a massive problem if you have a global empire. The British had the same thing after the Second World War. The empire shrunk rapidly with that bankruptcy. I mean, they even gave up the area where I'm currently living, which was the main source of income for the British Empire. And so the United States faces this problem. And so Trump, I mean, he's doing what all US presidents before him have done to try and keep the US as this hegemonic power globally. He is just doing things differently and a little ham-fisted. So, I mean, the basic, if you look between all of the insane and contradictory posts on Truth Social, what comes out is basically the rest of the world. It doesn't matter if you are neutral, if you are classified as an enemy or classified as an ally, it doesn't matter. Because, I mean, if we look at Kissinger, what did he say? The US has no permanent allies and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And
Mhm.
so the permanent interest is global hegemony. And so he is giving the rest of the world the grand golden opportunity to pay for the rehabilitation of the US empire through this economic warfare, which the rest of the world seems ungrateful to set about doing. So, I mean, looking at this, what is it going to achieve? Because Trump is at this moment that Gorbachev faced. Gorbachev, he knew the Soviet Union was dying
Mhm.
and that it needed radical reform in order to save. And he tried radical reform, which Trump is trying radical reform. And I would hesitate to guess that the results will be quite disastrously similar in that respect. And this is why you're getting this global south, which is becoming much more assertive. I mean, you look at how Russia and China are reacting to US coercion of Iran. They're not backing down, and Russia is not caving in to the different demands of Trump over Ukraine. So you're having South Africa, which brought about that International Court of Justice case against Netanyahu and the Israeli government for genocide in Gaza. So you're already having this growing rebellion. So my understanding, I mean, and if you look at the so-called economic powerhouse of Europe, Germany, I mean, it's finished.
Finished.
And yeah, I mean,
Yes.
even according to the World Bank, which is not renowned for being Russia friendly, uh, put out the analysis that according to purchasing power parity, Russia is the biggest economy in Europe. Germany is no longer. So, I mean, you're getting these changes, and Europe's doing it to itself. The United States is doing it to itself. I mean, this is not Russia forcing them or China forcing them to do stupid suicidal things. It's on their own free will. So, my guess is I always thought that the West would last longer, that it would be beyond my lifetime when the West collapsed. I no longer believe this. I believe that I will see the collapse of the West and the US in my lifetime, and increasingly soon, and especially if you look at this erratic behavior of Trump, because desperation is growing, and with desperation comes very, very poorly conceived, you can't even call it strategy, reactions to what is happening. And I mean, you have the. I mean, I think the reason why Trump initially had this idea of being the peacemaker president, which has not gone too well now, but the original intention was the geostrategic imperative of US dominance. Russia is considered to have won the Ukraine war. So it's a matter of marking time, but it's a waste of resources and effort which are needed elsewhere. And the same with Iran. The main focus was to talk about this, what Kissinger called the reverse Soviet Union-China coup, that to separate Russia from China, which he said would need to be done eventually. Of course, that doesn't mean that he will be best of friends with Russia. Russia is a means to an end in this US geostrategic imperative. So China is considered the main threat. But now, I mean, Chinese are just like sitting there with the popcorn like this and just watching, because, I mean, US is bogged down in not one war, but two wars, which are going out of control, where the client states are not doing what they're told. And neither Zelensky nor Netanyahu are doing what they're told and what is expected of them as client states. And this is, I mean, this has cost that opportunity to move those resources from there to be focused against China, which, I mean, you saw all these US think tanks have been talking about this for years, that there is a necessity to somehow weaken and contain China by 2025. If they don't, it's the finish.
Dear friends, I would like to thank my dear friend Dr. Greg Simons for his time and for the knowledge he has shared with us. I wish him good health and hope that he will join us on air again in the future.
And thank you, Ms. Shabanova, for your excellent translation and for your wonderful questions.
Mr. Doctor, our audience includes diplomats, ambassadors, foreign ministers, and academic representatives. What final message would you like to share with them?
I wish them the best of luck in managing these, should we say, interesting, according to Chinese understanding of interesting times, and the necessity to understand actions and consequences, which the West has long forgotten. They've been at the top for too long, and they have failed to understand that their actions do have consequences, including negative ones, on themselves. So use this moment as a real-time laboratory for understanding what should and should not be done in terms of politics and policy by what you see unfolding before your eyes. We are in a very unique moment in history where you're having a geopolitical transformation on this scale happening before our very eyes. So lessons should and need to be learned from this. Not only the good lessons, but also the bad lessons of things to avoid.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye, dear.